The crystal shattered on the cold marble. Silence cut through the air like a blade as 100 pairs of eyes turned to the man bent over on the floor. He didn't know that this humiliation would reveal the greatest secret of the mansion. No one imagined that in a matter of minutes, every laugh would turn to shame, every gesture of contempt to regret. Destiny had already been decided, but no one yet realized it. Before we dive into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're watching from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The music echoed through the halls like a golden river of melodies, mingling with the clinking of baccarat crystal and the laughter that sprang from human vanity. The air was thick with French perfume and ostentation. Each breath carried the scent of power and new money. The lights from the Czech crystal chandeliers danced on designer dresses and custom-tailored suits, creating a ballet of shadows and shimmers that turned the mansion into a living theater stage. In the midst of this glittering universe, one figure stood out like a wrong note in a perfect symphony. An elderly man moved with the slowness of someone carrying the weight of years and hardships. His hands trembled slightly as he held a small white porcelain plate, his calloused fingers contrasting with the delicacy of the object. He wore a grey jacket that had seen better days, the elbows slightly worn, the buttons lacking their original shine. His pants were well pressed, but the marks of a home iron were visible to anyone who looked closely. His black shoes, though clean, told stories of long walks and unpaved roads. They were not the Italian patent leather shoes that adorn the feet of the other guests. They were honest shoes, belonging to a man who knew the value of every step taken in life. The gentleman stood near the dessert table, as if the abundance of artificial light blinded him. His eyes, blue as a winter sky, wandered around the room without finding a comfortable place to rest. With every word he overheard, conversations about trips to Paris, art investments, summer homes in the Hamptons, he pulled his shoulders back, trying to dissolve into the shadows of the imposing Carrara marble columns. The women passed him like peacocks on parade, their heels echoing on the floor like little hammer blows in the silence of his solitude. The men gestured with Cuban cigars, talking of million-dollar deals as casually as discussing the weather. And he, the simple gentleman, remained there like a ghost among the living, invisible in his humility. "Did you see that man over there?" murmured a lady with a pearl necklace, pointing discreetly with her mother-of-pearl fan. "What do you suppose he's doing here?" "Probably some employee who got lost," replied another, adjusting her diamond earrings. "Or maybe he's the father of one of the staff. You know how it is. Sometimes they're too kind to these people." The murmuring spread like invisible ripples across the hall. Each whisper was a small stone thrown into the calm water of his dignity. But the gentleman pretended not to hear, or perhaps he truly didn't, lost in thoughts that took him far from that place, to a simple little house where love didn't need chandeliers to shine. It was then that a group of young men approached. They came with that exaggerated confidence that parents' money tends to provide, dressed in clothes that cost more than many families earn in a year. The leader of the group was a tall young man, his hair styled with imported gel, a Swiss watch glittering on his wrist like a small golden sun. "Excuse me." "Sir," he said, his voice laden with an arrogance barely disguised as politeness. "You're not from the kitchen staff, are you? We need more champagne at the center table." The silence that followed was like glass about to break. The surrounding conversations gradually ceased, as if an invisible hand were turning down the world's volume. All eyes turned to the unfolding scene, some with morbid curiosity, others with the sadistic pleasure of watching someone else's humiliation. The gentleman slowly raised his eyes, meeting the young man's gaze. For a moment, there was something indefinable in that meeting of generations. The old man carrying the wisdom of a life lived. The young man bearing the arrogance of one who has never faced real hardship. "No, son," the man replied in a low but firm voice. "I'm just a guest." The answer provoked muffled laughter among the young men. The group's leader exchanged glances with his friends, as if he had just heard the best joke of the night. "A guest," he repeated, raising his voice so more people could hear. "In those clothes? Sir, are you sure you haven't mistaken the party? Perhaps there's a meeting at the community church tonight." Laughter spread through the hall like wildfire. Every laugh was a whip lashing the old man's dignity. Some people drew closer, forming a semicircle around the scene, like spectators at a cruel circus where humiliation was the main event. "Look at this," another young man continued, pointing at the gentleman's shoes. "Even the shoes are vintage. Must be from the 70s, right? What a retro charm." The gentleman lowered his head, his fingers gripping the plate more tightly. The weight of others' shame seemed to press down on his shoulders, bending his proud posture. It was as if each laugh were a small hammer striking his soul, trying to break something that had been built over a lifetime of honest work. Somewhere in the mansion, far from that theater of cruelty, a figure watched everything through a strategically placed mirror. He was a middle-aged man, dressed in understated elegance that contrasted with the ostentation of the guests. His dark eyes followed every movement of the scene, every word spoken, every laugh that echoed through the hall. This man was Edward Miller, the true owner of that mansion, the host whom few knew personally. He had built his empire from scratch, transforming himself from a poor young man into one of the most respected businessmen in the country. But at that moment, watching that humiliation, he felt something that money could never buy: the pain of seeing his own history despised in the figure of that simple man. Because that humiliated gentleman was no stranger. He was John Miller, his father, the man who had raised 5 children selling vegetables at a farmer's market, who woke up at 4 in the morning to set up his stall, who never complained about the scorching sun or the rain that soaked his goods, the man who gave up his own dreams so that his children could dream bigger. Edward had invited his father in secret, wanting to surprise him, wanting to show him how much he had prospered. But now he saw his plan turn into a public nightmare, where his father's humility was treated as a flaw, where simplicity was a cause for laughter. His fists slowly clenched, his breathing deepened, and in that instant, something began to shift in the party's atmosphere. The host began to move. On the other side of the hall, John Miller tried to discreetly move away from the group of young men. But fate at times has its own plans. Taking a step back, his foot caught on a chair that someone had left out of place. He lost his balance, his arms flailing in a desperate attempt to steady himself. But it was no use. The porcelain plate flew from his hands like a wounded dove, spinning in the air for a second that seemed to last an eternity, before shattering on the marble floor with a sound that cut through the room like a gunshot. The shards scattered at the guests' feet, reflecting the light from the chandeliers like tiny broken mirrors. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, as if a dam of cruelty had been released, the laughter erupted again, louder, wilder, more inhuman. "Now we're talking," shouted one of the young men. "This is the performance we were waiting for." "Someone call the cleaning lady," said another between guffaws. John remained on the floor for a moment, among the porcelain shards, as if the world had stopped. His blue eyes reflected a deep sadness, but there were no tears. Men like him learn early that tears are a luxury they cannot afford. It was at that moment that the crowd parted. Edward Miller crossed the hall with firm, calculated steps. He didn't run, didn't shout, didn't show any hurry. But there was something in his presence that made people instinctively move away, like waters parting before a ship. The silence spread gradually. First, those closest stopped laughing. Then, like dominoes falling in sequence, the entire party plunged into a tense, expectant quiet. Edward stopped in front of his father and, without hesitation, knelt. With his own hands, he began to pick up the porcelain shards, one by one, with the care of someone handling precious relics. The gesture was simple, but its impact was devastating. The arrogance of the young men turned to bewilderment. The laughter turned to nervous whispers. The expressions of superiority turned to silent questions. Who was this man who knelt on the floor to help a simple guest? The answer would come soon, and it would change the lives of everyone present that night forever. The sound of the shards being collected echoed through the hall like small chimes. Each fragment Edward touched seemed to carry the weight of an untold story, of a life built brick by brick, of hands that knew the value of honest work. The guests watched the scene like paralyzed spectators in a play where the script had changed without warning. This elegant man, kneeling on the marble floor without a care for his designer suit, was breaking all the unwritten rules of that world of appearances. "Mr. Edward," someone in the crowd murmured, their voice filled with recognition and astonishment. The name spread through the hall like a whisper gaining strength, passing from mouth to mouth until it became a collective murmur. Edward Miller, the businessman who had built an empire, the man who had turned a small family business into a corporation that employed thousands, the host of this party, and there he was, on his knees, picking up the pieces of a plate broken by a man everyone had judged unworthy of being there. John Miller watched his son in silence, his blue eyes reflecting a mixture of pride and concern. He knew Edward better than anyone in that hall. He knew the kindness that lived in his heart, but he also knew the temper he had inherited from his family. When Edward felt wronged, especially on behalf of someone he loved, his reaction could be devastating. "Son," he tried to whisper, but Edward made a subtle gesture with his hand, asking for silence. The last shard was collected. Edward rose slowly, holding the porcelain fragments in his cupped hands as if they were diamonds. His eyes scanned the crowd, first finding the group of young men who had started the humiliation. The look he gave them was like ice and fire at the same time, cold in its restraint, burning in its intensity. "Albert," he said, addressing the butler who was watching the scene from the entrance of the hall. His voice was calm, but carried an authority that made the air vibrate. "Please, get a damp cloth to clean this floor." "Yes." "Mr. Miller," the butler replied, hurrying to carry out the order. The confirmation of the name hit the crowd like a silent bomb. Mr. Miller. There was no longer any doubt. The man who had knelt to help a simple guest was the owner of the mansion, the host of the party, one of the most powerful men in the state. The young men who had led the humiliation turned visibly pale, their arrogant expressions transformed into poorly disguised masks of terror. Suddenly, their expensive clothes seemed like inappropriate costumes. Their Swiss watches felt like handcuffs on their wrists, and their confidence evaporated like mist in the sun. "Mr. Edward," the group's leader stammered, his voice now small and trembling. "We didn't know that." "You didn't know what?" Edward interrupted, his voice still calm, but with a coldness that seemed to drop the room's temperature by several degrees. "You didn't know that this man deserved respect? You didn't know that human dignity isn't measured by the price of one's clothes? Or did you just not know who I was?" The silence that followed was devastating. 200 people were breathing in the same room, but the only audible sound was the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the entrance hall. Edward walked over to his father, who had managed to get up and was discreetly trying to brush the dust off his pants. He gently took the old man's arm, offering him support. "Dad," he said, and the word echoed through the hall like a confession that changed the entire context of the night. "Are you okay?" The revelation struck the guests like a lightning bolt. Dad, this simple man, whom they had ridiculed and humiliated, was the host's father. He was the father of the man who had invited them to this party, who offered them his hospitality, who paid for the champagne they drank and the canapes they tasted. A wave of collective shame swept through the hall. Expressions of horror replaced the arrogant smiles. Eyes darted away, unable to face the reality of what they had witnessed, and for many, participated in. John Miller gently touched his son's face, a fatherly gesture that spoke more than 1,000 words. His blue eyes shone with a mixture of love and concern. "I'm fine, my son," he said in a serene voice. "You don't need to worry about this. I don't hold a grudge against anyone." But Edward was not willing to let it go. His father might forgive, but he had seen enough to understand the kind of people he had invited into his home. People who judged by appearances, who measured human worth by the size of a bank account, who turned social differences into a reason for mockery. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edward said, raising his voice so that everyone could hear clearly. The tone was polite, but there was a firmness in it that made every word sound like a sentence. "I would like to introduce you to someone very special." He held his father's hand affectionately, a gesture that contrasted dramatically with the tension hanging in the air. "This is John Miller, my father, the man who raised 5 children selling vegetables at a farmer's market. The man who woke up at 4 o'clock every morning, including Sundays and holidays, to support his family with dignity. The man who never asked for anything from anyone, who never bowed to hardship, who taught his children that honor is worth more than gold." With each word, the silence grew heavier. Some people lowered their heads, unable to bear the weight of their own shame. Others remained paralyzed, like pillars of salt, transformed by the revelation of their own pettiness. "This man," Edward continued, his voice gaining emotional intensity, "worked for 50 years of his life so that his children could have opportunities he never had. He never missed a day of work. He never failed to put food on the table. He never lost hope, even when times were hard and money was scarce." John tried to interrupt his son, embarrassed by all the attention, but Edward pressed on, determined that everyone should hear every word. "When I was a child and we were going through hard times, my father sold his few personal belongings so we wouldn't lack anything. When I dreamed of studying but we didn't have money for books, he worked extra hours, carrying boxes, doing odd jobs, anything honest that could earn a few extra dollars." Tears began to well up in some people's eyes. The story Edward was telling was not just about his father. It was about millions of American parents who fight daily to give their children a better life, who sacrifice their own dreams in the name of unconditional love. "You laughed at him," Edward said, his gaze slowly sweeping across the crowd. "You laughed at the simplicity of his clothes, the humility of his gestures, the genuineness of his character. You laughed at the man who is the reason all of this exists." He made a broad gesture, encompassing the entire mansion with its works of art, its expensive chandeliers, its ostentatious luxury. "Everything you see here, every painting, every piece of furniture, every detail of this house exists because one day a simple man believed that his children could go further than he did. It exists because he never gave up, never surrendered, never lost faith in the future." Edward's voice trembled slightly on the last sentence, and for the first time that night, his perfect composure showed a crack. It was as if the emotion of talking about his father in front of so many people was breaking down the barriers he had built around his feelings. A woman in the crowd began to cry, then another. The sound of sobs spread through the hall like concentric ripples in a pond, touching hearts that had forgotten how to feel truly human. "My son," John whispered, touching Edward's arm. There was affection in his voice, but also a silent plea for him to stop, not out of shame for what was being said, but because he knew his son's generous heart and knew that this moment was hurting him more than it was hurting John himself. But Edward wasn't finished yet. There was something more he needed to say, something that would turn this night of humiliation into a lesson no one would ever forget. "I invited you to this party," he said, his voice now low but audible to all, "because I believed you were people of value. People who would understand that success only has meaning when it's built on solid foundations of character and humanity." The silence was so deep you could hear the night wind whispering through the trees in the garden. "But tonight you showed me who you really are. And I thank you for that." The phrase fell upon the crowd like a final judgment. There was no direct accusation, no shouting or threats, just the cold, painful realization of the revealed truth. What came next would forever change the lives of everyone present in that mansion. The echo of Edward's words still vibrated in the air when something unexpected happened. John Miller, with the serenity of one who has lived long enough to understand human nature, took a step forward. His hands, calloused from years of work, gently touched his son's arm in a gesture that spoke of unconditional love and accumulated wisdom. "Edward," he said, his voice low but firm, filled with an authority that came not from money or power, but from a life lived with dignity. "That's enough." The simple phrase cut through the tension like a sword of kindness. Edward looked at his father, seeing in his blue eyes not anger or a desire for revenge, but something far more powerful, compassion. "Dad, they humiliated you," Edward murmured, his voice filled with a pain that went beyond indignation. It was the pain of a son who sees his childhood hero mistreated by people not worth the soles of John's worn shoes. "So what?" John replied with a serene smile that transformed his tired expression into a manifestation of inner peace. "Son, I've been humiliated many times in my life. I felt small in front of people who thought they were big. But do you know the greatest lesson I've learned in all these years?" Edward remained silent, like a boy listening to his father's stories before bed. "I've learned that humiliation only hurts when it comes from someone we love or respect. And I don't know any of these people here." John looked at the crowd with the tranquility of a sage. "How can I feel humiliated by strangers who know nothing about my life, my values, or who I really am?" John's words had an even greater impact than Edward's fiery speech. There was a serene strength in them, a wisdom that transcended social class or formal education. It was the wisdom of a life lived with authenticity. An elderly lady who had been silently observing everything took a step forward. Her eyes were moist, and when she spoke, her voice trembled with emotion. "Mr. John," she said, removing the white lace gloves she wore. "My name is Helen Carter. I laughed when you stumbled. I laughed at your simplicity." And now, her voice broke, but she composed herself. "Now I would like to ask for your forgiveness." Helen's gesture broke an invisible barrier. It was as if her confession had given permission for others to face their own shame. One by one, people began to approach. "Mr. John," said a middle-aged man, removing his expensive watch from his wrist as if it suddenly weighed a ton. "I would also like to apologize. I didn't say anything, but I laughed on the inside. I judged you without knowing you. And I made malicious comments," confessed a young woman, tears streaming down her perfect makeup. "I said you looked out of place, but I was the one who was out of place. I was in the wrong place within myself." John observed each confession with the patience of a confessor, his eyes reflecting not judgment, but understanding. When someone finished speaking, he would simply nod, as if to say, "It's okay, I understand." But the young men who had initiated the humiliation remained paralyzed at the back of the hall. The group's leader, the one who had made the first cruel joke, seemed to have shrunk inside his expensive suit. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands trembling visibly. Edward noticed and walked toward them. The crowd parted automatically, creating a silent corridor. The sound of his footsteps on the marble echoed like a racing heartbeat. "You," he said, stopping before the group. His voice was no longer furious, but there was a coldness to it that was even more intimidating. "You started all of this. You turned my father's simplicity into a subject of mockery. What do you have to say?" The young leader slowly raised his eyes, meeting Edward's gaze. For a moment, it seemed he would try to justify himself, make excuses, blame others. But then his gaze shifted to John, and something inside him broke. He began, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I have no excuse, no explanation. I was cruel because I could be, because I thought I could, because no one ever taught me that." His voice failed him completely. "That what?" Edward insisted, that a simple man can be greater than a rich young man," the boy replied, tears finally welling up. "That dignity can't be bought. That I am nothing compared to your father." The brutal, honest confession created an even deeper silence. It was as if the truth had been spoken so rawly, so stripped of artifice, that everyone needed a moment to process it. John then did something no one expected. He walked over to the young man and, with the gentleness of a grandfather, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Son," he said, his voice filled with a tenderness that made many people weep openly, "you are not less than me. We are all human beings trying to find our way in life. The difference is that you haven't yet learned that the path of kindness is the only one worth taking." The young man broke down in tears, as if all the masks he had worn in his life had been stripped away at once, leaving him exposed and vulnerable, yet paradoxically more human than he had ever been. "Mr. John," he sobbed, how can you forgive me? How can you be kind to me after what I did?" John smiled, and his smile was like the sunrise after a long, dark night. "Because holding a grudge hurts the one who holds it more than the one who inspired it," he answered. "Because you are young and still have time to learn. Because my heart has no room for grudges. It's too busy holding love." John's answer echoed through the hall like a life lesson that transcended any formal discourse. It was applied philosophy, practical wisdom born from real experience. Edward watched the scene with a mixture of pride and learning. All his life he had admired his father for his strength, determination, and work ethic. But at that moment he discovered a new dimension of his father's greatness: the ability to forgive without demeaning himself, to teach without humiliating, to love without conditions. "Dad," he said, approaching, "you always surprise me." "And you make me proud, my son," John replied. "But remember, true strength isn't in showing power over others. It's in using that power to lift them up." The lesson was not just for Edward, but for everyone present. Rich or poor, powerful or humble, every person in that hall was receiving a masterclass in humanity taught by a simple man who had never attended a university, but had graduated from the school of life with honors. Maria, the housekeeper who had worked in the mansion for 15 years, watched everything from a corner of the hall. Her eyes shone with emotion as she saw the transformation taking place in that room. She had known Edward since he was young, knew of his kindness, but also of his tendency to judge harshly those he considered unjust. That night, however, she was witnessing something different. She was seeing the son learn from the father, the powerful bow before the wisdom of the simple. The rich discover that true wealth was not in his bank accounts. "Mr. Edward," she said, approaching discreetly, "may I suggest something?" Edward looked at her, recognizing in the woman's expression something she wanted to share. "Of course, Maria, go ahead." "How about we end this party here?" she suggested delicately. "I believe we have all received more than we expected tonight. Perhaps it's time to let everyone process what they've learned at home." The suggestion was wise. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, revelations, and intimate transformations that needed time and silence to consolidate. Edward looked at his father, seeking approval. John nodded with a smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edward announced, his voice now completely different from the one he had started the night with. There was no more coldness or judgment, just a learned serenity. "I believe our night of reflection has come to an end. I thank you all for the sincerity you have shown." People began to move slowly, like those waking from a deep dream. But before they left, many approached John to greet him, to touch him, as if they wanted to take a piece of the peace that emanated from him. The night wind began to enter through the open doors, bringing the coolness of the garden and carrying away the heavy air of revelations. It was as if nature itself was helping to clear the atmosphere, preparing the space for a new beginning. The farewell was unlike any party's end that Mansion had ever seen. There were no loud laughs, no animated conversations about the next social events. or empty promises of we must see each other more. Instead, a silent procession of transformed people walked through the main door, each carrying with them more than they had brought. Helen Carter was one of the last to leave. Before departing, she approached John again, holding a small golden card in her hands. "Mr. John," she said, extending the card, "this is the invitation to my granddaughter's wedding next month. It would be an honor to have you and your family with us." "A true honor?" John accepted the invitation with a gentle smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Helen. Health permitting, we'll be there. And Mr. Edward," she continued, turning to the host, "I hope you'll accept my apologies. Tonight taught me more about character than years of formal education." Edward nodded respectfully. "Accepted and appreciated, Mrs. Helen. Go with peace in your heart." The young man who had started the taunts was the last of his group to approach. His friends had already left in silence, but he had remained as if he needed something more before leaving. "Mr. John," he said, his voice still choked with emotion, "I know words can't erase what I did, but may I ask something?" John gestured encouragingly with his head. How do you do it? To be like this? To forgive so easily? To not hold on to anger?" The question was filled with genuine vulnerability. It was the question of someone who recognized they had lost something important in life and wanted to find out how to get it back. John thought for a moment, as if carefully choosing the words that could change this young man's life. "Son," he said finally, "when you've worked since you were a child to support a family, when you see your children hungry and you have to find the strength to go on, when life teaches you that every day is a struggle, you learn something important. Wasting energy on anger is a luxury we can't afford." The young man listened to every word as if he were receiving a treasure. "Besides," John continued, "anger is like holding a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone. You're the one who gets burned first. And I have too much to do, too many people to love, to spend my time getting burned. But how do you find the strength to love after so much hardship?" John smiled, and his smile was like a window opening to let in the light. "Because it's precisely because of the hardships that love becomes more important, son. When you go hungry, you learn to value every grain of rice. When you're cold, you learn to value every ray of sunshine. When you suffer, you learn to value every gesture of affection." The young man remained silent for a long moment, processing the words. "Mr. John, I would like to learn to be like you. I don't know how, but I would." "Start small," John replied wisely. "Tomorrow, when you wake up, look around and find someone who needs help. It could be a homeless person on the street, an elderly person struggling, an overworked colleague. Help without expecting anything in return. Do that for a week and you'll see how different you feel." "Is that all?" "That's all. The heart is educated through small gestures, son. There is no school for kindness, only daily practice." The young man nodded, memorizing every word as if he were learning a prayer. "Thank you, Mr. John. Thank you for teaching me that there's still time to change." After the last guest had left, the mansion fell into a different kind of silence. It was not the empty silence of abandonment, but the full silence of reflection. Edward and John remained in the main hall, watching Maria and the other staff discreetly clear away the last traces of the party. "Dad," Edward said, loosening his tie for the first time that night, "I'm so sorry about all this. I wanted tonight to be special for you, and it ended up turning into one of the most important nights of my life," John interrupted, surprising his son. "What do you mean?" John walked to one of the large windows overlooking the illuminated garden. The full moon reflected in the marble fountain, creating a spectacle of light and shadow that looked like it was out of an impressionist painting. "Edward, how many times in life does a simple man like me get the chance to teach something important? How many times can he touch the hearts of so many people at once? Those young people, especially that boy who spoke to me last, they're not bad. They're just lost." Edward approached his father, observing the serene profile silhouetted against the moonlight. "But they humiliated you, Dad. They laughed at you. So what? John turned to his son with a smile. Son, I raised 5 honest, hard-working children. I have 15 grandchildren who respect and love me. I've built a life based on solid values. Do you think the laughter of a few strangers can diminish all that? Edward remained silent, processing his father's wisdom. Besides, John continued, that laughter taught me something about you that I didn't know. What? That even being rich and powerful, even with all this success, you still love your old father enough to defend him. That's worth more than all the gold in the world. John's words struck a deep chord in Edward's heart. For years, he had feared that success would distance him from his origins, that money would create a barrier between him and his family. But that night, he discovered that true love is stronger than any social difference. Dad, I have a confession to make, Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. Go on. My son, sometimes I feel guilty about my success. I wonder if I deserve all this while you still live so simply. I wonder if I should have done more, given more. John interrupted with a wave of his hand. Edward, you gave me the greatest wealth a father can receive, pride in who he raised. Every achievement of yours is an achievement of mine. Every person you employ, every family you support through your company, every social project you fund, all of this is the fruit of the seed I planted when I taught you the value of honest work. Father and son stood in silence for a few moments, contemplating the illuminated garden. It was as if all the tension of the night was dissolving, giving way to a deeper understanding between them. Dad, Edward said finally, can I ask a question I've always wanted to ask, but never had the courage? Well, of course. Do you ever regret giving up your dreams for ours? Did you ever feel angry for working so hard and having so little to show for it? John chuckled softly, a sound full of contentment. Son who says I have little to show, look around you. He made a gesture that encompassed not just the mansion, but everything it represented. All of this is mine too, not because it belongs to me legally, but because it was built with the values I taught, with the ethics I passed down, with the love I shared. Edward felt his eyes moisten. Besides, John continued, my dreams weren't abandoned. They transformed. My dream was to give my children a better life. Mission accomplished, as you young people say. The English expression sounded funny coming from the simple man, and they both laughed, definitively dissolving the tension that still lingered between them. Dad, I want to make you a proposal, Edward said, suddenly struck by an inspiration. I'm listening. How about we change things around here a bit? This mansion is too big for one person. What if you came to live with me? We could turn the east wing into an independent house for you, with its own entrance. A private garden. John shook his head with a gentle smile. Son, I appreciate the offer, but my place is in my own simple house. That's where I feel at peace, where I have my neighbors, my routine, my life. Edward had expected this answer, but he had to try. But I can do something else, John continued. I can come here more often. We can have family dinners. I can get to know your real friends better. We can spend more time together. That would be wonderful, Dad. And you can come to my house more often, too. I still know how to make that Sunday stew you loved as a child. The memory of the stew brought a nostalgic smile to Edward's face. It was a simple recipe, with cheap ingredients, but prepared with so much love that it tasted like a royal feast. Maria approached discreetly, waiting for a pause in the conversation. Mr. Edward, may I suggest something? Of course, Maria. How about I make some coffee for you both? We still have that cornbread cake that Mr. John brought yesterday. Edward looked at his father in surprise. You brought a cake? John laughed, slightly embarrassed. Your sister Teresa made it. I thought you might like to try it. You brought a homemade cake to a gala, Edward said, shaking his head in amusement. Only you, Dad. Teresa's cake is just that good, John defended himself. And I thought that amidst all this sophisticated food, you might miss a taste of home. Edward hugged his father, a long and tight hug that said more than any words could. Let's have that coffee and eat that cake, he said. And you're going to tell me how the whole family is doing. I want to know about every grandchild, every story, every piece of news. And so, as the night quietly advanced upon the silent mansion, father and son truly reconnected, discovering that time had not created distance between them, only different perspectives on the same unconditional love. The mansion's kitchen had never hosted such an intimate scene. Under the soft light of the copper lamps, father and son sat at the solid wood table where the staff ate their meals, a space far more welcoming than the imposing main dining hall. Maria had prepared coffee in a blue enameled coffee pot, the kind John immediately recognized as the same type he used at home. The aroma spread through the room like an invisible hug, bringing back memories of simple mornings and unpretentious conversations. The cornbread cake was cut into generous slices, its golden color contrasting with the white porcelain of the plates. It was an image that seemed to come from a painting of everyday American life, simple, true, profoundly human. "Teresa still makes the cake exactly as our mother taught," John commented, watching Edward take the first bite. "The same recipe for 40 years. Edward closed his eyes, savoring not just the sweet, but the memories it awakened. It was as if each grain of cornmeal carried fragments of his childhood, rainy afternoons in the small kitchen, the smell of the cake baking while he did his homework at the living room table, the feeling of security that only a home made of love can provide. It's incredible how a taste can bring so much back," he murmured, opening his eyes to meet his father's affectionate gaze. "The heart's memory has taste, smell, texture," John replied, taking a sip of the strong coffee. "That's why it's more powerful than the mind's memory. The mind forgets dates, numbers, names, but the heart forever remembers the taste of the first time someone we love cooked for us." Maria had discreetly withdrawn, leaving father and son alone with their memories and discoveries. The silence that settled between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had finally found the time and space to truly reconnect. "Dad," Edward said, playing with the cake crumbs on his plate, "can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" John nodded, his expression encouraging the confidence. "A few years ago, when the business started to grow very quickly, I felt lost. I had money, power, recognition, but—" Edward paused, searching for the right words. "But I felt empty, like I had lost something essential along the way." John remained silent, allowing his son to find his own rhythm for the confession. "I started having nightmares. I dreamed I was in a room full of strangers, applauding my achievements. But when I looked around, I didn't recognize anyone, not even myself. I would wake up sweating, afraid I had become someone you all wouldn't recognize anymore." The vulnerability in Edward's voice deeply touched John. Here was his successful, admired, powerful son, revealing fears he never imagined existed. "Is that why you've been a bit distant from the family these past few years?" John asked gently. Edward nodded, unable to find words to explain the shame he felt. "Son," John said, reaching out to touch Edward's hand, "do you want to know something? I was afraid too." "Afraid of what, Dad?" "Afraid that my simple love wouldn't be enough for a son who had conquered the world. Afraid that my small house would be embarrassing for someone used to mansions. Afraid that my simple words would sound foolish to someone who talks to great businessmen." John's confession surprised Edward. He had always seen his father as unshakable, sure of himself and his place in the world. "But do you know when that fear went away?" John continued. "When?" "Tonight, when I saw you kneel to pick up the pieces of a broken plate. When I heard you defend my dignity as if it were the most important thing in the world. In that moment, I understood that no matter how much money you have or how high you've climbed, you're still my boy." Edward felt tears forming, but this time he didn't try to hold them back. "Dad, I'm so afraid of disappointing you all." "Edward, look at me," John said, using the firm tone he used when his children were little and needed guidance. "Do you think you would disappoint your mother if she were alive to see all this?" Do you think your siblings aren't proud of you? That your nieces and nephews don't speak with admiration of their Uncle Edward? But sometimes I feel so distant from it all. Distant. Son, you employ 400 families. You sponsor scholarships for 50 young people a year. You built a children's hospital. Do you think that's being distant from reality? Edward had forgotten that his father closely followed all his activities, even from a distance. How do you know all this? John smiled tenderly. Son, do you think a father stops following his children's lives just because they grow up? I read every newspaper that mentions you. I ask your siblings how you're doing. I discreetly visit the projects you fund. You do that? Of course I do. And do you know what I see? I see a man who uses his success to do good. I see someone who hasn't forgotten where he came from. I see my son applying in life the values I tried to teach. The revelation that his father watched him from afar, proud and attentive, removed a weight Edward had been carrying for years without even realizing it. Dad, can I ask a question that might sound strange? All your questions are welcome. Do you love me the same way you did when I was a child? Even with all this, Edward made a gesture that encompassed the mansion, symbolizing all his wealth. John laughed, a sound full of love and amusement. Edward, you're 45 years old and you're asking if I still love you? Son, a father's love doesn't have an expiration date. It doesn't diminish with distance or get impressed by money. I loved you when you were a boy selling brownies at school to help out at home. And I love you now that you're a successful businessman. The only difference is that now my pride is even greater. Edward stood up from his chair and hugged his father, a boy's hug that had finally found its way back home. For a few minutes, they remained like that. Two men from different generations, united by the invisible, indestructible thread of family love. When they separated, Edward realized something had changed within him. It was as if an old wound had finally healed. Dad, from now on, things are going to be different, he said with determination. I want you to come for dinner here every Friday. I want to get to know my nieces and nephews better. I want to be more involved in the family's life. And I want you to come to my house on Sundays, John replied. Teresa always cooks too much, and it would be good to have someone to help finish the food. They both laughed, the tension of years dissolving into simplicity and mutual affection. Dad, can I tell you one more thing? Always. The real reason I organized this party today was because I wanted to impress you. I wanted to show how much I'd prospered, how many important people I knew. And it worked, John said with a mischievous smile. It worked. Yes, you impressed me, but not because of the important people you know or the beautiful house you have. You impressed me because you've become a man who defends his father, who cares about others, who uses his power to protect instead of attack. Edward shook his head, marveling at his father's wisdom. How do you always manage to turn my flaws into virtues? Because that's what love does, son. It doesn't ignore the flaws, but it puts them into perspective. And because I know you have a good heart, you just sometimes forget to trust it. The conversation stretched into the early morning. They talked about his siblings, his nieces and nephews, about future projects and past memories. Slowly, Edward rediscovered the pleasure of simple conversation, of unhurried time, of company without an agenda. When the first ray of sun began to appear on the horizon, painting the garden in golden hues, they both realized they had spent the entire night talking. The sun's already up, John observed, looking out the window. The best night I've had in years, Edward replied. For me too, son, for me too. And there in the simple kitchen of a luxurious mansion, father and son discovered that true wealth was not in the walls that surrounded them, but in the love that united them, a love that had withstood time, distance, and the transformations of life, emerging even stronger after being tested by the fire of adversity. 3 months had passed since that transformative night. The mansion had gained a new soul, a different rhythm, an energy that hadn't existed before. Fridays became sacred, the days when John would arrive in the late afternoon, always bringing some culinary surprise prepared by Teresa or by neighbors who had gotten used to sending dishes for Edward's father. On this particular Friday, John arrived earlier than usual. He found Edward in his office, poring over papers and spreadsheets, but with a very different expression from 3 months ago. There was peace on his son's face, a serenity that money alone had never been able to provide. "Working late again?" John asked, knocking lightly on the open door. Edward looked up and smiled, a genuine smile that had become much more frequent in recent weeks. "Hi, Dad. I was just finishing up here. We have a special guest for dinner tonight." "A special guest? Remember that young man from the party? The one who made the jokes?" John nodded, remembering the repentant young man perfectly. "Well, he sought me out a few weeks after that night. He wanted to know if I could help him find volunteer work. He said your words had completely changed his perspective on life." John's face lit up with interest and curiosity. "And did he?" "He did, and much more than that. He started by helping at a nursing home. Then he signed up for an adult literacy project. Last week he told me he's organizing a coat drive for the homeless." Edward got up from his desk, putting the papers in a drawer. "He asked to have dinner with us tonight because he wanted to thank you personally. He said that 5-minute conversation changed his life more than all the years of therapy he'd had." John shook his head. "Modest as always. I just said what anyone with a little life experience would say." "Dad, you always underestimate the impact your words have on people." They walked together down the hallway that led to the main hall. The atmosphere was completely transformed. Where there once were imposing furniture and ostentatious decor, there was now a more welcoming space. Edward had replaced many of the expensive pieces with objects that had a history. An armchair that had belonged to his grandparents, a solid wood table made by a local craftsman, paintings by regional artists, but the most significant change was on the main wall. Where an abstract painting that cost a fortune once hung, there was now a portrait of John, painted by a local artist. It was not a technically perfect work, but it captured something far more valuable than technique. It captured the essence of kindness. "I still can't get used to this," John said, looking at his own portrait. "And I never get tired of looking at it," Edward replied. "Do you know how many people have stopped to ask who the man in the painting is? And what do you tell them?" "The truth. That he's my father, my greatest role model, the man who taught me that success without character is no success at all." The doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of the special guest. Maria hurried to answer, and soon appeared accompanied by a young man whom John recognized immediately, though at the same time he almost didn't. It was the same young man from the party, but completely transformed. Where there was once arrogance, there was now genuine humility. Where there was once contempt for others, there was now a spark in his eyes that spoke of someone who had discovered the joy of helping. "Mr. John," he said, approaching with a mixture of shyness and emotion. "Thank you so much for agreeing to see me." "Of course, son. How are you?" "I'm doing well, sir, very well. In fact, better than I've ever been in my life." Edward watched the scene with satisfaction. There was something deeply gratifying in seeing two people who had connected through kindness meet again. "Mr. John," the young man continued, "I brought some photos to show you." He opened a folder and took out several photographs. They were images of the volunteer work he had been doing, him reading to seniors in a nursing home, teaching a 60-year-old man to write his own name, distributing soup to the homeless on a cold night. "This gentleman here," he said, pointing to a photo where he appeared next, to a smiling elderly man, "is Mr. Anthony. He's 82 and taught me how to play dominoes. Do you know what he told me the other day?" John and Edward awaited the answer. "He said I have a good heart, but that I probably took a while to discover it. And he was right. It took me 25 years to discover that helping others is much more enjoyable than just thinking about myself." John smiled, recognizing in the young man something he had planted on that night 3 months ago. "And you know what's most incredible?" the young man continued. "My parents are proud of me for the first time in years, not for the money I spend or the parties I go to, but for the people I help." "That's very beautiful, son," John said. "But tell me something. How do you feel when you're helping these people?" The young man thought for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. "I feel complete, as if I've finally found my place in the world, as if I've discovered what my life is for." "That is true wealth," John replied with wisdom. "When you discover that your life can make a difference in the lives of others, you become a true millionaire." During dinner, the conversation flowed naturally. The young man talked about his future projects, the friends he had made through volunteering, and how his worldview had completely changed. "You know something funny," he said between bites. "Those friends I was with at the party that night, some of them have reached out to me too. They wanted to know why I had changed so much, why I seemed happier." "And what did you say?" Edward asked. "I said I had learned the difference between having success and being successful. Having success is getting what you want. Being successful is wanting what you get when you become a better person." The answer impressed both Edward and John. There was a philosophical depth in the young man's words that showed how much he had matured. "Some of them have started volunteering too," he continued. "We're still in the early stages, but it's a start." After dinner, the three of them settled in the living room. Edward had a fireplace installed, not because the mansion needed heating, but because the sound of the crackling fire created an atmosphere of intimacy and coziness that the old decor lacked. "Mr. John," the young man said, "may I ask a personal question?" "Of course. How did you manage to raise a son like Edward? I mean, how does one pass on such solid values in a time when everything seems to be changing so quickly?" John looked at Edward, then at the fire in the fireplace, carefully choosing his words. "There's no magic formula, son, but I think it has to do with consistency. It's no use talking about values if you don't live them. Children learn much more by watching than by listening." "Can you give an example?" "When Edward was little, we went through a very difficult financial time. One day I found a wallet on the street with a lot of money inside, money that would have made a huge difference for our family at that moment." Edward sat up straighter in his armchair, vaguely remembering the episode. "I took Edward with me to return the wallet to its owner. He asked me why we didn't just keep the money, since no one had seen us find it. I replied that someone had seen us." "Who?" the young man asked, completely absorbed in the story. "We had, and that if we did something wrong, we would have to live with that memory forever. I explained that losing money hurts for a few days, but losing respect for yourself hurts forever." Edward remembered that afternoon perfectly now. He remembered how his father had talked to him on the way, how he had explained that being honest sometimes came at a cost, but that being dishonest always cost more. "It was one of the most important lessons I ever learned," Edward said, "not just about honesty, but about how what we do when no one is looking defines who we really are." "Exactly," John agreed. "Character is what you do when you think no one is watching. But the truth is, someone is always watching. Yourself." The young man remained silent for a few moments, absorbing the depth of the lesson. "Mr. John, can I visit you again sometime? I would very much like to continue learning from you." "Of course, son. This house is always open to people of goodwill. And who knows," Edward added, "you could bring some of those friends who are starting to volunteer. We could form a group, exchange experiences, maybe organize larger projects." The idea visibly excited the young man. "That would be amazing. We could meet once a month to share stories and plan joint actions." And so, something that none of the three had planned was born, but which would become one of the most important things in their lives. A group of people dedicated to making a difference in the world, not through grandiose gestures, but through small, consistently repeated acts of kindness. When the young man left that night, he left behind more than gratitude. He left the certainty that kindness, once planted, multiplies in ways we can neither predict nor control. Father and son remained in the room, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "Dad," Edward said, "sometimes I think about how much our life has changed since that night of the party." How has it changed? It's become simpler, and paradoxically, much richer. John smiled, understanding perfectly what his son meant. "Do you know what the biggest change was for me?" John asked. "What?" "I discovered that you not only inherited my values, but you improved upon them. You took what I learned in life and built something even greater." Edward felt his eyes fill with tears of gratitude. "Thank you, Dad, for everything, for teaching me, for forgiving me when I drifted away, for being here now. Thank you, son, for giving me the opportunity to discover that my job as a father didn't end when you grew up, for showing me that I still have much to teach and much to learn." They remained in comfortable silence, two men of different generations, united by love and mutual respect, knowing they had found something money can't buy, the peace of being exactly where they were supposed to be, being exactly who they were supposed to be. Outside, life went on as normal, but inside that mansion, which was once just a symbol of material success, something much more valuable now breathed. A reunited family, hearts open to love and service to others, and the certainty that true wealth lies in the bonds we build and the lives we touch. And when the last log was consumed in the fireplace and they finally said goodnight, they both knew they had found the most precious treasure there is. The certainty that the years they had lived, the struggles they had faced, and the dreams they had pursued were all worthwhile. Because in the end, it's not the mansions we build that define our greatness, but the bridges we build between hearts. And that bridge, between father and son, between past and present, between simplicity and success, was stronger than ever. If this story touched your heart, like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.